I am Tamar Ish Shalom, and this is Jewish Crossroads. Rabbi David Wolpe is one of the most influential rabbis in America, consistently recognized for his leadership and thought-provoking work. He recently completed a remarkable 26-year tenure as the senior rabbi of Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. He is the senior advisor in Maimonides Fund and an inaugural rabbinic fellow for the ADL. In addition to his leadership, he's the author of 8 books, including Why Faith Matters and David, The Divided Heart, a bestseller. Rabbi Wolpe has also made headlines for his principled actions, like stepping down from Harvard's advisory group to combat anti-Semitism on campus. It's truly an honor to have him with me today. Shalom, Rabbi Wolpe.
Shalom. Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
I'd like to start with a personal question, if I may. Obviously, our identity evolves throughout our lives, but after leading a community for more than a quarter of a century and dedicating your whole life to exploring Jewish identity, your Jewish identity must feel quite solid. Yet, I'm curious, has this past year, since October 7, revealed a new aspect of your Jewish identity that you weren't previously aware of?
What a wonderful and probing opening question. I think the answer is almost inevitably yes, although I'm not sure that I wouldn't spin it slightly to say, as opposed to a new aspect of it, it deepened parts of it that were fairly dormant. Among other things, my personal involvement with anti-Semitism weirdly changed, and I'll speak about that in a second. But the other piece of it is that I got a very different view of where I stand in the American Jewish community because I saw how many Jews did not share the assumptions that I really thought bound us all together. And that was painful to see. The reason I say I changed in terms of anti-Semitism is I remember growing up thinking, anti-Semitism was my father's problem, but it's not really what's going to constitute my rabbinate. And then I was in a congregation that had about 60% Persian Jews, and for them, anti-Semitism was a constant of their lives. And I kept saying, we have to focus on Judaism and the Jewish future. It's a different place, America, and so on. And then last year happened, and I thought, you can't escape from history.
And history sometimes catches you in present. If we will talk extensively about anti-Semitism in this conversation. Mm-hmm. Before that, if we zoom out and look at the year that has passed since October 7, while recognizing that we're still very much in the midst of ongoing developments, how have these events shaped or maybe even transformed American Jewish identity beyond the immediate impacts on individuals or communities?
I actually think it's worked in opposite directions. That is, I know people who took off their Magen David or, in a couple of cases, their kippah, but I know many, many people who did exactly the opposite. I mean, I put up mezuzahs for people who had never had one on their door because now they wanted one. And I think it strengthens people's identity if it doesn't scare them away. And so, as often happens, Abba Eban once said, Jews like their clouds without silver linings. So there is a silver lining to this cloud, though, which is that many people were reclaimed. And I think there are more to be reclaimed once they recognize that Jewish identity is actually both something to be proud of and even more, not something that if you have strength of character, you shouldn't hide.
Yeah, because, one thing that struck me was the reaction of many Jews who aren't part of an organized community. I mean, people who don't identify with any specific denomination, non-affiliated Jews, some of which are good friends of mine, who were drawn to seek connection, community, a place where they felt safe, understood, maybe a place where it was legitimate to mourn together. How do you understand this reaction, especially given that for many of them, their connection to Jewish identity had been fairly minimal? I mean, they could just as easily have chosen to disengage entirely at this point, considering that the cost of being Jewish today feels higher than ever, but instead they chose to reconnect.
So this has to do, I think, with what I try to explain to people, not only I, many people try to explain peculiar about Judaism in the constructs of the West. Since Judaism grew up before the Western world, it's not a religion, and it's not an ethnicity, and it's not a race. It's some hybrid combination of all those things. I call it a religious family. And even when you're estranged from your family, when something terrible happens, you know, it's like Robert Frost's definition of home is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. And that's what the Jewish people is for the Jewish people. So if a Jew comes and says, I'm a Jew, we have to take them in. And I think for a lot of people feeling scared, they thought, I don't care that I haven't been close with my parents, my brothers, my sisters. This is my family. And so they returned.
It's a mishpucha.
It's a mishpacha, exactly.
But the moment we are in seems to be a pivotal point for Jewish identity, as you said, of seeking community and meaning. But do you think this is a defining moment that in a way will reshape the future of Jewish community as well? Or is it more of an emotional, temporary reaction, and in a few months or years we'll return to previous patterns?
By disposition, my normal assumption is the second, that people are people and they end up doing what they did before. I was saying this before COVID. When COVID's over, everybody who says the world has changed forever, I said, no, it hasn't. It's going to be the same after this is gone. But here I'm going to go against my inclination, because I think the great change was that in a way that is now inseparable, this fused the identity of American Jews and Israel. In every American Jew has to have a stance on Israel somewhere along the line. And I don't think that that was true before October 7th, and I don't think it's going to change. And this is, in some sense, a new age. This is like the post-Holocaust age. I don't know what we'll call it, but no, I think this changed things, and that change will be accelerated by lots of other things like AI, like the political developments in Israel over time. American Jewish identity, I think, is in a molten process of reforming.
And for community leaders, the challenge at this point is enormous because of what you're observing. I mean, ensuring that this moment, despite all of its complexity and hardship, can lead to a long-term positive change. I mean,
so
how is that done?
This is exactly why I'm at the Maimonides Fund. This is the work that we are trying to do, is actually explore how to take this moment and use it for a long-lasting positive change in the American Jewish community. And the question of how it's done is a really both important and fascinating question that nobody has the answer, obviously, but I think that it clearly involves elements of education of young people, redevelopment of leadership, and reconnection of different communities, Jewish communities that have been estranged from each other, who I hope recognize that what connects them is much greater than the divisions that we have seen.
Could you elaborate a bit about first thoughts, let's say, of how that would be achieved?
There are all sorts of conferences and groups and meetings and endless Zooms being put together and meetings of people who up to now have not had much contact with each other in different areas of the American Jewish world, because for the first time, they find, we all have the same fundamental interest. And whether you approach it from this direction or that direction or the other direction, unless you're a completely self-contained opt-out, which there are small enclaves, then you have to be part of this great enterprise together. There are just too many interesting, creative people working on this to not want to be part of that, hopefully, you should excuse the phrase, great leap forward.
That as an Israeli, one of the emotional realizations for me after October 7 was how deeply American Jews care about Israel, not just in terms of solidarity with brothers and sisters in distress. That's obviously,
Right.
We know that, but also as an integral part of their own identity. And this somewhat surprised me, and let me explain why. As a journalist, I've covered many of the rifts between Israel and American Jewry, especially over the past decade, the justified sense of betrayal Some felt regarding the withdrawal from the Western Wall Agreement by the government, attempts to change the law of return, the treatment of women of the wall. And moreover, polls about the younger generation have been very clear that their connection to Israel has been weakening, and many of them no longer see Israel as a central part of their Jewish identity. But then October 7 happened, and it seems that it revealed deeper layers in this relationship. How do you understand this?
One of the ways I understand it is the same way that someone can take their parents for granted, but a parent gets sick, they all of a sudden realize how deeply they actually feel connected to it. The reason people could estrange themselves from Israel was because there is an Israel, because they took it for granted. And also, this generation has not experienced a major event in Israel until October 7th. 73 is not in their memory, and that was the last major world event in Israel that struck American Jews as a major world event. Like even the Intifada, as terrible as it was in Israel, unless you really were connected to Israel, it did not affect your day-to-day life as an American Jew. This did. And I think it awoke people to the fact that they were not as distant as they think. This is not a perfect analogy, but I've used this in respects about one's fear of death. So I do a lot of flying. I'm on planes all the time. And I'll read, and I'll eat, and I'll work, and I'm not scared at all. But let that plane hit turbulence. And all of a sudden,
I know that feeling.
I think, yes. I realize I must actually be afraid, but I'm not paying attention to it because everything's fine. And I think the same was true here. It's like, I don't really feel connected to Israel, but when Israel looks in trouble, in a serious way, all of a sudden I discover that actually it's foundational to which is why I haven't paid attention to it.
Why is it foundational?
Because Jews, it almost goes back to early Zionist theory and Pinsker. It's like Jews were a soul without a body. We're very disembodied if we don't actually have a place that's ours. And it allows Israel, in a weird way, permits the diaspora, because we do have a place. So we are, like all the other nations, we have a place that is uniquely our own, and we take that for granted, except when we can't.
You mentioned anti-Semitism, your thought that it was a problem of our parents. I think that many shared that illusion. And, we all saw and believed that anti-Semitism was on a decline, and maybe it was part of an optimistic view that the world is always progressing. In the past few years, we've witnessed a disturbing surge in anti-Semitism. Since October 7, it has worsened and exploded. And I think it became clear to all of us how quickly things and good things can regress. Were we naive? And what did we fail to grasp or anticipate about anti-Semitism's persistence?
I think one of the things that we did not actually sufficiently credit is how much immigration from the Middle East would create a backlash, and part of the polarization, a little bit of American society, but certainly of European society, is on both sides. Who do we blame for this terrible? And anti-Semitism both is always a conspiracy theory, and it creates coalitions. And so on the right and on the left, the Jew was the convenient victim. That was one thing that we knew, but we didn't see it developing. And the other thing that I think we were not aware of was the extent to which the narratives that upheld Western society, once they began to crumble, like America was not as pristine as we always said. In fact, there was, it was built on slavery, and there was a genocide of the Native Americans, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I learned that in school, but it was not given any weight. Once people were growing up and those narratives were given sufficient weight, what happens into the psyche, this happens all the time in religion, is people assume disillusion is truth. And so you only hear the counter narrative. And people then began to see Western civilization as essentially bad. And Israel has made its case forever and ever, like the Jews are on the vanguard of Western civilization and have given you Western civilization. And when that becomes bad, so do we. And you see this in the far left circles, that anything, when we always thought, just send around the list of Nobel Prize winners and everyone will love us. But that actually, in a weird way, becomes a negative. In other words, you are the image of the achieving colonialist white power structure that has made a wreckage of all these other nations. And so I think Jews were ridiculously unfairly, but understandably identified with people, and that had all the anti-Semitic tropes just waiting to be used to reinforce prejudices that arrived from other places. That's at least a piece of it.
Yeah, and another piece of your analysis that the younger generation is growing up with a crisis of trust in institutions and authority and even traditional media, while also navigating the overwhelming influence of social media. So could you expand on this intriguing perspective on how it shapes the landscape of anti-Semitism today?
Well, social media is, as you know, toxic waste dump. And anything that appeals to the more negative and more unkind stereotypes, especially of groups you're allowed to attack. And you're not allowed to attack certain minority groups, but you are allowed to attack Jews because they're not seen as a minority group. And these young people who've grown up knowing much more about the institutions that surround them than we did. So one of the examples that I always use is Kennedy and Clinton did basically the same thing, but everyone knew about Clinton and no one knew about Kennedy because the reporters around Kennedy would hide the fact that he had affairs. Once transparency started to grow, disillusion started to grow because now we know that these institutions aren't good. So we're going to see things ourselves, which means you start to see conspiracies behind everything. They were trying to present this, but it's really that. And unfortunately, at the bottom of every conspiracy theory is a Jew. I don't know why, but it's like Soros controls the world. This has been true forever and ever. And at least one theory that I've said many times because I think that it's so fascinating. A lot of this was supercharged by the origins of Christianity because Judaism and Christianity had this family fight because all the early Christians were Jews, but unfortunately it got put in a sacred book, so it stays forever. Anti-Semitism is unique in that Jews are both subhuman and superhuman. They're like vermin who run the world. If you look at the Nazi stuff, that's exactly what it says. The English scholar Hyman Maccoby had this theory that the reason that that's so is you can't kill a god unless you're super evil. And so there is this trope, I think, planted in the Western mind that then got transferred to the Muslim world that really almost required an exorcism, that behind every evil, ultimately, there is this super evil genius, and that's identified with the Jew. And I know this sounds crazy, but again and again and again, you see this. Doesn't matter what it is that happens that is bad in the world, someone somewhere will assume that the Jews were behind it. And by the way, when Jews parrot their own accomplishments, we just feed in weirdly to this narrative. It's like,
every noble,
right,
every noble,
every prize, of course, because they're the ones that run everything.
So do you agree with Franklin Foer's recent piece in The Atlantic suggesting that the golden age of American Jewry is ending partly due to the weakening of the liberal order that you described?
Yes.
I mean, where Jews thrived, and the rise of identity politics, which seems to alienate Jews from this discourse. I mean, in a world that is increasingly dividing people into oppressors and oppressed, where do Jews fit in? We don't seem to.
I thought he was more pessimistic than I would be. I think it's a very fine piece and like deeply reported. And when I knew it was, I had spoken to him and I knew it was coming out, and I didn't expect it would be so really detailed and impactful. And yet, part of it, I have to confess, is I'm constitutionally optimistic or hopeful. I just was built that way. My daughter once said to me, "Dad, it really bothers me that you always think everything's going to be fine, but I'm really glad that you always think everything's going to be fine." So I get that. First of all, the two things that I would push against is one, the prevalence of identity politics has now created a tremendous backlash against the prevalence of identity politics because people know ultimately this is a sucker's game. You can't win if everybody only sees themselves as part of Group A or Group B or Group C. And if there isn't a greater narrative that ties us together, there's no society. And yet, at the same time, the thing about identity politics is that the prevalence of groups is what has protected Jews in America. Because for most of Jewish history, we were the only identified other. Like in, I remember years ago, there was a bomb in front of a synagogue, and I think I I may be wrong, I think it was Jacques Chirac, I don't remember who it was, said Frenchmen and Jews were killed. But of course, all the Jews were also Frenchmen. But you wouldn't have that in America. You would never have somebody say Americans and Jews, because there are so many different groups that we can create alliances. And while Jews are not always good at embracing their friends, we're really good at identifying enemies, but not embracing friends. There are a lot of people who I think are better disposed towards Jews than Jews sometimes think. And
do you think that there is a future to these alliances that we have seen in the past?
Right.
If we're talking about, Rabbi Abraham Heschel and et cetera. And we see them maybe less nowadays?
Think we see them less nowadays, but I also think that there is a sort of systolic, diastolic movement to this. You see them less, and then they'll grow, and then other alliances will happen. We have a very present tense bias. Right now, things are bad, so therefore they will always be bad and get worse. But things get better, too, because if you'd gone back to the 1930s, anti-Semitism was much worse than it is now. I think we judge down. I really think there's a lot of work going on about this. Many people who aren't Jewish, who are basically neutral, were shocked at the resurgence of anti-Semitism. I hope that will create something of a backlash.
We're diving into the campuses and universities. One of the more troubling things I've heard over the past year is Jewish students sometimes feeling the need to hide their identity in campus. I mean, Jewish students who expressed their identity openly and went to pro-Israel rallies, they obviously faced hostility, and it came at a heavy price that required real courage, and I admire them. But I must say that my heart went out to the Jewish students that felt they had to hide part of who they are just to get through the year safely. And I know I might be exaggerating, but it echoed for me, as a Jewish person, a much darker history of Jews hiding their identity, and the idea that this is happening in America is almost unimaginable to me, having grown up with admiration for American pluralism.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I also, there are echoes. It is obviously not the same, but there are echoes of history where Jews had to hide. And I remember that if you ask me what was the most shocking, not shocking, but the most revelatory single moment of the year at Harvard, it was on October 8th when I went to the Hillel, just because I thought the students would need and a couple of the Jewish faculty showed up, which was wonderful. And there was a student there, and she had served in the IDF. And she told me, I'm afraid to walk at night to my dorm. And I thought, wow, if you're afraid on Harvard's campus and you served in the IDF, something very bad is going on here. I think that, and especially the initial shock of seeing people that you lived next door to and were close to, and this, again, is a trope that we know from Jewish history, and we're friendly with, and now all of a sudden they will not speak to you, literally will not speak to you, is very scary, especially because I'm sure that a lot of your listeners remember college was a very fragile age, and social connection was everything. And to be a pariah in college, it's like high school and college can be awful. And so that's also part of the answer of the Jewish solidarity. The Jewish students got a lot closer because they knew they could talk to other Jewish students.
And it was a safe
It was a safe place, right?
Yeah. And I want to go into your decision to leave the Harvard Advisory Group to combat anti-Semitism on campus, and we'll get to the reasons for your departure in a moment. But first, why did you join, and what change did you believe was possible, and do you still think that change is achievable in elite American universities?
I joined, immediate reason is because the president asked me to, and I thought it was ironic. I thought, like, when I first came, I thought, how am I going to, other than, like, I was going to sit in the library and write a book, none of which ever happened. But I thought, how am I going to get my way into the place? I only have a year here. I'd like to know something about it, how it works, and so on and so forth. And then after October 7th, the president called me and said, I want to put together, it wasn't originally, I want to put together. It was originally, the call was, this terrible thing happened. She said, the Middle East is not my expertise. What kinds of things should I read about anti-Semitism in the Middle East? Because that's what I am. I'm a reader. And so someone had suggested that she call me. And then we had a discussion. And in the course of the discussion, she said, I want to put together a committee to advise me about questions of anti-Semitism, and would you be on it? And I said, of course. And at the time, I didn't know it was going to get quite this bad. But she, to her credit, the people she put on the advisory committee were all serious Zionists. Dara Horn was on that committee, and Martha Minow, the former dean of the law school, and Eric Nelson, who's professor of government, and many others, all of whom were serious, and the meetings were, I thought, really productive, and yet every suggestion we would make was not done. And at a certain point, this then became public, so I'm not telling any secrets because this was all supposed to be confidential. At a certain point, 5 of us said we were going to resign, and we wrote a letter, and we hand-delivered it to the president's office, which was the only time that Penny Pritzker, who's the head of the board of governors, I'm the head of what they call the corporation, that sort of Grisham-like entity that runs Harvard, showed up at the meeting and said, no, President Gay has presented a plan to us, and please don't leave, and we really are dealing with this. And we said, okay. And so we stayed, and then the hearings happened. And that, together with the fact that none of our recommendations had been enacted, and students would come to us every day with complaints, and they would say, I called into the line and I never heard, and it didn't matter what we said, it didn't seem to make a difference. After the hearings, I called the president and I said, look, I'm in an impossible position because I felt like I was giving credibility to something that wasn't credible. I said, I know you're in an impossible position. I regret the fact that my solving my impossible position will make yours worse. And she said, well, what could I do? And I said, you could do this, 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 and this, which were all the things we were recommending. And by the end of the phone call, it was clear that that wasn't going to happen. And so I thought, there's no point for me to be on it. And I went to the other members of the committee. In a way, it was easier for me to resign because I was the only member of that committee that didn't really have a prior loyalty to Harvard. I felt like my loyalty was to the Jews. And all of them had either, Dara went to Harvard and had worked on alumni associations, and all the others were currently professors or deans or whatever. And so one of them was on the board of Harvard. And so they all said, it makes perfect sense for you to resign. I didn't know. I really didn't know it would make such a stir.
You didn't expect it?
No. I mean, I thought people who knew me would say, good for you. One person, I don't think that now it's, I don't know if he would mind, but one person who was a past president of Harvard, not Larry Bacco, and a different past president, had called me and told me that I shouldn't go on the committee in the first place because he did not think that they would be serious.
He anticipated it.
He anticipated it. And so I thought the people who thought you shouldn't have done this or who thought you were wasting, they would be, but that millions and millions of people on social media would react to it, I had no idea. But that's when I realized how much pent-up fury there was that the elite institutions in America had betrayed everyone. And also I realized that there was something so iconic about the name Harvard that if I had resigned from the Princeton Advisory Committee, it would not have been the same. But there's something about Harvard that is symbolic. And when someone says to Harvard, some words that I cannot say on a podcast.
Please
but you can,
do. We're interested.
But you can imagine words that a rabbi ought not to say on a podcast. When someone says that to Harvard, there are a lot of people behind you who will cheer.
Yeah. In retrospect, how do you understand this decision they made not to take action after bringing all of you together for the committee?
I have two different explanations, and they're complementary. One is that I think the way you become president of a university is by making friends and by being agreeable. And then I think it's very hard to turn to all the people who put you in that position and say, I have to do something you don't like. And it takes you to be a leader, you have to be both agreeable and disagreeable.
Yeah.
And it's hard to be both. That's one. And then what everybody thinks about Harvard, part of it is true. They think we're Harvard. We've been here, since the dawn of time. We are one of the presidents told me we are the most important NGO in the world. And so we'll be fine. And like, yes, they're complaining now, but we're Harvard, so who cares? And I think that attitude was there too.
Yeah, so between the lines, what you're saying is lack of leadership, because leadership requires hard decisions.
And also because I don't think they thought of the Jews as a group that who could be vulnerable or hurt or had to be protected. It was like, they'll be fine. And there was that too. There was some condescension, and also amongst certain parts of the Harvard world, there was anti-Semitism.
That's amazing, because it really relates to Jews Don't Count, David
Yes,
Nadir.
exactly.
I mean, you're not a minority.
Yep.
Everyone is a minority, but Jews aren't, because you're doing fine, especially in the U.S.
Which, by the way, was one of the books that I recommended to Claudine Gay.
Oh.
Specifically because his book is not about being a Zionist. It's about that reality that Jews just, they don't count. And also like at HDS, which is where I was, they have a long history of anti-Semitism because it was founded as a Christian school, and Christianity in America had strong strains of anti-Semitism as it did in Europe. Mm-hmm. So
it was reported that not a single graduate of the prestigious Ramaz school applied to Columbia University this year, and many Jewish parents and students are wrestling with the question whether attitudes toward Israel or Jews should influence their choice of college. Given your experience at Harvard, what advice would you give them?
So this is the advice that I give to parents. I said, look, if your kid has a specific reason to go to Harvard, if there's a department they want to study at or a professor they particularly, or if they are very resilient, if they're a fighter, send them, because I don't think we should abandon these elite institutions. But if what they want is just the name, don't do it. It's not worth it. That's not worth it. There are so many good schools out there, and there are so many good professors and departments, and go to a place that wants you, as opposed to forcing your way into a place that has, very mixed record. So that's what I would say now too. It should not be the default. And nobody is going to think, when you look at the record of achievement in America, it's not like you have to go to Oxford and Cambridge. Most of our presidents did not come from the elite colleges. Some did, but a lot didn't. And so I think, I remember Nixon went to Whittier and Reagan went to some small college in California, and it is possible to make your way up in this society from almost anywhere. And this world is full of really good institutions of learning. So if you have a particular reason to go there, go, but don't think you have to get a degree from an Ivy League school to succeed in this world. In fact, as we know from the software world, a lot of the most successful people in this country didn't go to college at all.
Or didn't finish college.
Yeah.
Though giving up on Ivy League university is a high cost. For overachieving young
Right. Well, that's
Jewish
why
Americans.
I say if you have a particular reason, like if you're, I don't know how many of your listeners ever watched the Gilmore Girls, but it was her entire dream to go to Harvard, and then she ends up at Yale. But the point was that really was her dream. And if Rory Gilmore had been Jewish and had come to me and said, look, it was always my dream to go to Harvard, I would say, okay, go to Harvard. But if it's just, this is going to be a good name on my resume, don't. It's not worth it.
I think this dilemma isn't just faced by Jews in the U.S. It's also relevant somewhat in Israel. The Wexner Foundation recently cut ties with Harvard. And I myself attended a wonderful program at Harvard Business School half a year before the war as part of the Ma'oz Fellowship. Mm-hmm. And I must say that when this question arises about the future, my position is that if Israel is not welcome in such an important academic space, in the campus's atmosphere, at least, if not officially, we need to insist on being there. If Israeli institutions adopt the same stance as the BDS movement, that Israelis shouldn't attend elite university, that plays right into their hands. Now, obviously, the intention is positive, but the outcome might play to their hands. And while I totally understand why Jewish American or Jewish Israelis must choose a place that feels safe and welcoming, on a broader systematic level, I hope we don't see campuses devoid of Jews.
I agree, but somebody who has your attitude should apply, because then they're going to go and be resilient. But if your kid is not that person, if your kid is the person who's going to feel like they have to hide for 4 years, that's not what you want. If they have moxie and they want to go on campus and wear a Magen David, I think that's great.
I think there's another interesting parallel between Israeli Jews and American Jews right now, that both had a sense of deep security in the existence of Israel for Israelis and in living in America for American Jews that was shaken after October 7. And in Israel, many families are now asking questions around the Shabbat table that were never discussed before, like whether our existence in Israel is guaranteed, what the future holds for us. This wasn't a topic in Shabbat dinner before October 7. And this summer, I sat at a barbecue with Jewish friends here in America, and one of the women spoke about how she finds herself wondering more and more about the future of Jewish existence in America, a question she had never considered before. How do you respond to these questions of Jewish existence and the fragility many people now feel for the first time in their life?
So, first of all, I listen to it and I acknowledge it and I don't dismiss it. And I know, just like about anything, that the future of Jews depends on more than Jews. It depends on what happens in America. It depends on what happens in the world. In Israel, if tomorrow the Iranian regime collapsed, things would change dramatically in the Middle East. So there are always unexpected and unanticipatable developments that I can't necessarily speak to. But I think the future of Jews in America depends more on Jews than it does on their neighbors. If Jews continue to get a Jewish education and continue to be in solidarity and continue to send their kids to Jewish summer camps and continue to support schools and synagogues and so on, there'll be a Jewish future in America. The greatest danger still to Jews in America is not anti-Semitism. It's ignorance and assimilation and drifting away and not caring. So in that sense, I think actually it is a renewed challenge to the existence of a Jewish community in the diaspora. And that's a lot of hard work.
I'm picking up for there and to your book, Why Be Jewish.
Right.
You wrote there, living as a Jew means being different. And being different takes courage. But there is no training for the soul that is as important and as bracing as a schooling in courage. And this was written, I think, nearly 30 years ago and seems so relevant to our days and to this point of Jewish existence.
I used to tell high school students that the single most important quality to lead a good life was courage, because without it, you're a slave. And you have to be, then you live someone else's life and you hide the Magen David and so on and so forth. And that's what, I really think that this is, this is the generation when American Jews have to put a mezuzah on their door. I really believe that you have to be able to declare who you are. And if you don't, then, I'm reminded that the Kotzker Rebbe has a great line. He says, if I am someone else, who will be me? And so if you give up on who you are, then you may as well not have been created uniquely as you. So yes, I really think that emotional courage, it's a different kind of courage. It's not physical courage. American Jews are spared that. Israeli Jews are not. But if you don't have to display physical courage, at least some emotional courage would be good.
What gives you hope for the future of American Jewry? How do you envision Jewish identity evolving as we continue to face these crises?
Well, what gives me hope, honestly, is Jewish history. I know that we have faced far worse than this multiple times in the past. And although Jews tend to have short memories, Judaism has a long memory, but Jews sometimes have short memories. I've studied Jewish history, and I know how many times Jews have felt this is the end, it's over, and in fact, it's not the end. And the future of Jewish identity, I do think that young Jews in America will be a generation of reinvention, both because AI and technology are going to force them to be, and also because the way that I grew up does not. I just see a younger generation doesn't fit them. It doesn't fit them. The institutions that worked for me don't work for them. And so I see my job not as, oh, they should work for you, but as helping to the extent that I can to enable younger people to create the institutions that work for them.
Yeah, we need to work for the younger generation.
Yeah.
Rabbi Wolpe, as we near the end, I'd like to inaugurate our Crossroads Corner with you. 5 quick questions for every guest. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
What's your earliest Jewish memory as a child?
My earliest Jewish memory is probably, there are 2 that compete, lighting Hanukkah candles with my family and walking to synagogue with my father.
If you could meet any Jewish figure from the distant or recent past, who would it be and why?
Well, I wrote a biography of King David, and I find him endlessly fascinating. He was a very complex figure, good and bad, and I would love, and must have been unbelievably charismatic. I would go for David.
What is your favorite or most meaningful Jewish tradition?
Believe it or not, the most meaningful Jewish tradition to me is waking up every morning and saying Modeh Ani, being grateful to God that I'm alive, and that means a tremendous amount to me.
You know that my little one has just started to go to Jewish school here, and in the mornings she started saying,
I think
singing
gratitude,
in home or Danny. That didn't happen back in Israel. That's new. Thank you, American Jewish.
Gratitude is the essential religious emotion. It really is. And that's why, like Rabbi Nachman says, that despair is the great sin, because if you have faith, then you have to be grateful.
If you could jump 100 years into the future in one sentence, what would you hope to see for the Jewish people?
That they are strong and confident and secure and numerous.
Finally, one Jewish word that feels particularly meaningful to you at this moment. It could be Hebrew, English, Yiddish, whatever.
Chutzpah.
Always the best word. Yeah. I mean, yeah. For any moment.
Easy, right? Exactly.
Rabbi Wolpe, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
It was a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Jewish Crossroads. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to write to us at jewishcrossroadspod@gmail.com. Thank you to Tomer Atzabi Bar, who edited this chapter. We'll see you next time, same place, same journey, with a new voice. See you soon.